My name is Claire, and on April 18th, I found out just how dangerous it can be when a privileged heir decides the rules don't apply to him. That Thursday began like any other. I was at my desk by 7 a.m., coffee in hand, sorting through the quarterly reports for our most important client, the same client who'd helped save our company from collapse the previous year. I was deep in numbers when the door slammed open. Enter Nathaniel Carter. 19 years old. CEO's son. A boy born with everything, but who had yet to earn a thing. He stormed in wearing an expensive suit that looked more borrowed than worn, fury in his eyes, the kind that only comes from being denied something he was never entitled to in the first place. "You think you can ignore me?" he shouted, pounding his fist on my desk. "When I give an order, you follow it." I didn't flinch. I remained professional, seated. "Nathaniel, I don't take orders from interns." His face turned crimson. "I'm the future CEO. You'll regret this." I arched an eyebrow. "Then I'll deal with you when you actually are the CEO. Until then," I gestured to the door. "Kindly leave my office." I knew brushing him off like that would come back to haunt me, I just didn't realize how soon. Let's rewind a few months. That's when our CEO, Richard Carter, announced that his son would be joining the company for experience. Most of us assumed it was a temporary vanity project. He'd shadow a few teams, get bored, and disappear back to wherever entitled heirs go. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, Nathaniel was handed the title of Junior Operations Director, a role I had worked 5 years to earn. No qualifications. No clue how our business ran. But somehow, he believed that meant he could boss me around. Initially, I let it slide. I corrected his blunders behind the scenes, fixed his disastrous reports before they reached clients, and even covered for his missed deadlines. Why? Because I believed in this company. Because I didn't want to rock the boat. And maybe, just maybe, because I hoped he'd eventually grow up. He didn't. The final straw came 2 weeks before that Thursday. Nathaniel barged into my office and tossed a file on my desk. "Fire the Johnson team." They annoyed me. The Johnson team, my team, had just secured a $3.5 million contract. "I'm not firing anyone because they annoyed you," I said, measured. "I'll tell my father you refused a direct order." I met his glare. "Feel free." He stormed off. I assumed Richard would set him straight. I was wrong. The night of our annual spring gala, I was there representing our international clients, the very division I had spent 6 years building. The night was flawless. For a moment, it felt like everything I'd worked for was finally being recognized. Then my phone buzzed. One message from Richard Carter. "Claire, please come to my office first thing tomorrow." My stomach dropped. I barely slept. By 7:30 the next morning, I was in Richard's office. He wouldn't look at me. "Claire, I'm afraid I have to." I cut him off. "Check your inbox." His face went pale. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting everything. I had sent him a folder the night before, 43 emails from Nathaniel. Some were absurd, others bordering on criminal. Orders to falsify reports. Demands to manipulate financial data. Direct threats like, "Just do what I say or I'll make sure you're out." Richard stared at the screen in shock, color draining from his face. "I had no idea," he said quietly. I folded my arms. "Didn't you?" He winced. Because of course he had. Maybe not all of it, but enough. It was easier to ignore when it was his son throwing tantrums. Easier until the truth was staring back from his inbox. "Claire, why didn't you come to me sooner?" I kept my tone even. "Because I thought this company stood for merit. And because I didn't want to be the reason your family imploded." His eyes flickered with something between shame and fear. My board can never see this. I didn't budge. I'm not here to blackmail you. I'm here because your son walked into my office yesterday and told me to fire a team that just saved you millions. And when I said no, he promised to ruin me. I let the silence hang. I want my job. I want my team safe. I want this to end before it destroys everything. Nathaniel? That's your problem to fix. I walked out with my head held high. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was about principle. About proving that hard work still counted. But come Monday, it was clear Nathaniel wasn't done. The retaliation was subtle, at first. Emails I was inexplicably left off. Meetings mysteriously rescheduled. Budgets delayed. Classic corporate sabotage. One morning, I saw him smirking as I was excluded from a strategy session. He even had the audacity to wink. Entitled men like Nathaniel think power is a game they can manipulate. What they never understand is, sometimes the people they try to step on are the ones holding everything up. A week later, Richard summoned me again. You were right, he said quietly. Nathaniel's out of control. Have you talked to him? I tried. He won't listen. He said if I don't suspend you, he'll go to the board. I laughed, not because it was funny. 19 and threatening boardroom drama. Impressive. Richard didn't laugh. Claire, I need to suspend you. Just to de-escalate. It's not personal. I looked at him, stone cold. It never is. He winced. I'll make it right. But I already knew he wouldn't. He'd fold to Nathaniel, sacrificing me, the person who'd built his most successful division, just to appease his son. I nodded and walked out without looking back. But I wasn't broken. Because Richard didn't know, I'd been ready for this. That morning, I didn't leave as a victim. I left as someone prepared. Because months before Nathaniel ever kicked down my door, I'd seen the shift. Clients growing uneasy. Senior staff asking pointed questions. Deals I negotiated being quietly reassigned. Nathaniel was moving in on my division, and Richard was letting it happen. So I did what they didn't expect. I documented everything. Every reckless order, every backroom deal, every client complaint. But I didn't keep it to myself. I reached out to the only two people in the company I trusted implicitly, Marta Chen, head of compliance, and David Alvarez, senior legal counsel. They had worked with me for years and had both expressed concern about Nathaniel more than once. And together, we started preparing for what came next. Over coffee, off the record, I laid everything on the table. Marta listened first, brow furrowed, then shook her head. Claire, this could blow everything up. David, always measured, agreed. If this goes to the board. I met both their eyes. It needs to. Not for me, for the future of this company. They were silent for a moment. Then Marta leaned in, voice steady. I'm in. David nodded. So am I. And that's when the real work began. Long nights poured into cross-checking every contract Nathaniel had manipulated. We compiled detailed logs of every compliance risk he'd created, ones that could have triggered federal scrutiny. David drafted a series of internal memos, confidential but precise, outlining potential fiduciary violations and the people directly or indirectly responsible. Marta uncovered something bigger. One of Nathaniel's so-called pet projects had skirted dangerously close to violating international trade regulations. If I hadn't quietly stepped in 2 months earlier, the fallout would have crippled us. So by the time Richard called me in for that suspension meeting, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry. Because I knew what was coming next. The board wasn't going to hear about Nathaniel's recklessness from me. They'd hear it directly from their compliance and legal departments. But that wasn't my only card to play. The last, most crucial piece was Eastbridge Global Holdings, our biggest international partner. I'd cultivated that relationship for years. I was well aware they had reservations about Nathaniel after a disastrous meeting he tried to lead solo. So I arranged lunch with Michelle Tan, their head of partnerships. We kept it casual. No pressure. But when I gently asked about their future contract plans, Michelle didn't hesitate. "Claire, off the record, if you leave, so do we." I blinked. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," she said. "We don't invest in chaos." That was all the leverage I needed. The day my suspension hit the internal company feed, just one short, sterile sentence, two events happened almost simultaneously. Marta and David submitted their findings directly to the board. Meanwhile, Eastbridge sent a formal letter of concern to Richard Carter himself, warning in no uncertain terms that unless leadership changed, they'd reconsider their partnership. It wasn't subtle. And it wasn't empty. I wish I could say I felt victorious. But I didn't. I just felt resolute. Because Nathaniel had spent months trying to get rid of me with threats and tantrums. What he didn't count on. I had already prepared for war. The moment that internal suspension memo went out at 9:17 a.m., the dominoes began to fall. By 10:05 a.m., the board had Marta and David's full report. It wasn't sensational. No dramatic accusations. Just hard facts. Nathaniel had interfered with financial reporting on several occasions. He had issued directives beyond his authority, endangering client contracts. He had compromised compliance processes. And Richard, either by negligence or deliberate avoidance, had let it happen. The report ended with one quiet but forceful recommendation. Immediate review of leadership behavior and potential breaches of fiduciary duty. By 11:30, the boardroom was sealed. I wasn't inside, of course. But Marta texted me constant updates. "Richard looks like he's aged 10 years. Nathaniel's blaming you. The board isn't buying it. They want answers. Real ones." I read every message calmly. I hadn't gone public. I hadn't leaked anything myself. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. At around 2 p.m., Richard called. I ignored it. He called again. Still ignored. By the third try, I picked up. "Claire, we need to talk." I let him sit in the discomfort. Let him sweat over the damage control he was now forced to do. We met later that day. His office felt different. Hollow. No Nathaniel hovering in the background, no false confidence in his voice. He looked exhausted. "The board wants to speak with you tomorrow," he said quietly. I nodded. "Anne." He hesitated. "They've requested Nathaniel's immediate resignation. And for me to step aside temporarily during the investigation." I didn't react. "That sounds appropriate." He let out a bitter laugh. "You really pulled it off. You destroyed him." I looked him straight in the eye. He did that to himself. I just refused to hide it for him. For a second, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he deflated. "You were the best we had," he said softly. "I should have had your back." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I walked into a boardroom I'd never been invited to before. 12 directors sat waiting, formal, composed, unreadable. But the moment I sat down, something shifted. They didn't interrogate me. They didn't accuse. They listened. I told them the truth. Calmly. Professionally. I laid out the contracts I'd secured, the risks I'd mitigated, the international partnerships I'd preserved despite Nathaniel's reckless interference. I backed it all with documentation. They asked questions. They nodded. And at the end, the board chair leaned forward. Claire, we'd like you to step into an interim leadership role for the international division while we work through this transition. I couldn't believe it. Not only was I reinstated, I was promoted. But I didn't let the moment sweep me away. Because leadership can be revoked just as quickly as it's given. Titles change. Influence shifts. But respect? That's earned. And that's something Nathaniel Carter would never regain. 2 weeks later, he was gone. No farewell note. No send-off. Just, absent. Rumor had it he'd been sent overseas to oversee family investments. Quiet exile, corporate style. As for Richard, he stepped down voluntarily, citing personal priorities. The internal memo praised his contributions and commitment to a smooth transition. Translation: walk away and we won't air the rest of your dirty laundry. On my first official day as interim director of international operations, I walked by Nathaniel's old office. It was completely empty. The only trace of him? A nameplate on the desk, collecting dust. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. Because this was never about revenge. It was about protecting the people who had to navigate his chaos, day in and day out. I gathered my team for a quick meeting. No fanfare. No lofty speech. Just one promise. I don't care about names or titles. I care about work, integrity, and mutual respect. That's how we move forward. For the first time in weeks, I saw genuine relief in their eyes. Within a month, Eastbridge renewed their contract. Not because we begged them, but because Michelle Tan called me directly. We want to work with leadership that gets it, she said. And that's you. Other clients followed suit. Deals began closing. The company didn't just recover, it started thriving again. Then came the final twist. The board invited me to a private dinner. I wasn't sure what to expect, but sitting there across from directors who once treated me like just another manager, I realized the dynamic had shifted. They weren't looking at me as a temporary solution anymore. They saw a leader. The chairman leaned in. Claire, we'd like to offer you the permanent role, Vice President of International Operations. Effective immediately. I took a moment to let that sink in. Then I answered. I have conditions. He nodded. Let's hear them. I laid them out. No nepotism in leadership, zero tolerance. Executive accountability, transparent and enforceable. Full authority to shape and protect my team, on my terms. He nodded after each point. Agreed. I signed the contract a week later. Not for the prestige. Not even for the pay raise. But because I didn't want anyone else to fight tooth and nail just to be treated with basic respect. As for Nathaniel? Last I heard, he was bouncing around Singapore, trying to impress investors while burning through what was left of his trust fund. Some things never change. It's funny, though, when you build your empire on arrogance and fear, it collapses the moment someone stops playing by your rules. Looking back now, it's clear, Nathaniel tried to ruin my career because I didn't obey. Richard tried to discard me to save himself. But neither of them understood something vital. Real power doesn't come from inheritance or intimidation. It comes from competence. From character. From the loyalty of those who believe in your leadership. And that's something no heir, and no weak-willed CEO, can ever fake.